Judge mocks black elderly man in court. Shocked when he called his daughter, and everything changed. The heavy doors of Jefferson County Courthouse creaked open, and the murmurs inside the room swelled into a low hum of judgment. Elijah Brooks stepped forward, his worn boots pressing against the polished floor, each step deliberate, unshaken. The scent of old books and varnished wood mixed with the cold sterility of the law, a place where verdicts were less about truth and more about power. The whispers began immediately, a tide of quiet disdain rising from the spectators. Some barely concealed their scoffs, others muttered under their breath. "Another drifter," someone murmured. "What's the point of this trial? Just another bum trespassing where he doesn't belong." Elijah heard them, but he did not react. He had learned long ago that dignity was not something given, it was something held on to, no matter how many hands tried to pry it away. At the front of the room, behind the elevated bench, Judge Logan Barrett barely lifted his gaze from the file in front of him. The man was a fixture of this courtroom, known for his harsh sentencing, his indifference disguised as justice. To him, the law was a hammer, and men like Elijah were just another nail to be driven into the ground. "Next case," Barrett said, his voice sharp, clipped, a sound that had sent hundreds to prison, stripped people of hope, and left no room for sympathy. The assistant district attorney, a woman in a stiff navy suit, stood with a practiced efficiency. Her voice was steady, clinical. "Case number 47,629, the state versus Elijah Brooks, charged with criminal trespassing on private property, Clearwater Estates. This marks the defendant's second offense within 6 months." A low ripple of murmurs moved through the gallery. Second offense. That meant this wasn't just a mistake. That meant this was deliberate, a pattern, a problem to be fixed. Barrett exhaled, rubbing his temple as if this case was nothing but a waste of his precious time. Finally, he looked up, his cold blue eyes settling on Elijah like a weight. "Let me get this straight," Barrett said, leaning back slightly. "You were caught trespassing. Again." Elijah stood tall, his voice calm. "I was sitting by the lake." A beat of silence. Then Barrett let out a short, dry laugh. "The lake," he repeated, as if the very idea was absurd. His smirk widened. "You mean the one that belongs to people who actually paid for that property?" Scattered chuckles rippled through the courtroom. Not loud, but enough. Enough to remind Elijah that here, he was not seen as a man, but as a mistake. Still, he did not react. He did not lower his gaze. Barrett tapped his gavel lightly against the bench, a gesture more of impatience than of maintaining order. "Men like you," he said, shaking his head, "always think nostalgia is a form of ownership. You believe that because a place once meant something to you, it still belongs to you. But that's not how the world works." Elijah remained still, his breath steady. Barrett's eyes flicked down to the file in front of him. 6 months ago, it was Westbrook Country Club, he mused. Now Clearwater Estates. Tell me, Mr. Brooks, what exactly gives you the right to ignore property laws, to walk onto someone else's land as if it were your own? Elijah inhaled, slow and controlled. When he spoke, his voice was the same, measured, even. "I never said it was mine, Your Honor." For a brief second, something flickered across Barrett's face, a hesitation, a moment of unreadable thought. But then, just as quickly, his expression hardened once more. "That," he said sharply, "is not how property rights work." The room felt tighter, the air heavier. Every person watching understood how this would end. Barrett leaned forward, fingers laced together. "You've been here before, haven't you?" he said, flipping through the file, his voice carrying mock amusement. "Seems like you have a habit of showing up in places where you don't belong." The finality in his tone settled like a stone in the room, the weight of inevitability. "I have to say," Barrett continued, his smirk widening, "I admire the consistency. But you see, the law doesn't operate on sentimental value, Mr. Brooks. It doesn't care where you used to fish as a child or where you once walked freely." He sighed, feigning disappointment. "And yet, men like you seem to think that just because life hasn't been kind, the rules don't apply." The words hit the air like a slap, but Elijah did not flinch. He had heard these words before, from teachers who told him to sit at the back, from bosses who dismissed him before they knew his name, from strangers who clutched their belongings when he walked past, from police officers who pulled him over just for existing in the wrong place. He had heard it so many times that it was no longer surprising. Barrett sighed, lifting the gavel slightly. Men like you don't learn from fines, he said, shaking his head. They don't learn from community service. He let out a soft, knowing chuckle. They need real consequences. The words settled over the room like a death sentence. Barrett did not hesitate. I hereby sentence you, Elijah Brooks, to 30 days in county jail. The gavel slammed down. The gavel struck down with a force that seemed to shake the very foundation of the courtroom. The sharp crack echoed against the high ceilings, a final and absolute declaration. 30 days in county jail, a sentence that did not fit the crime, a punishment that was not about law but about power. A decision that had been made long before Elijah Brooks ever stepped foot inside that courtroom. For a moment there was nothing. No murmurs, no whispers, no shuffling of papers. Even the court stenographer, whose fingers had been clicking away at a furious pace just moments ago, hesitated for a fraction of a second before continuing, as if she too had not expected that verdict. The assistant district attorney, who had delivered the charges with mechanical precision, blinked. Her professional mask did not slip, but there was the barest flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. She had recommended a fine, maybe community service at most. A man like Elijah Brooks, an old, frail, non-violent man, did not belong in a jail cell, but she did not argue. She did not object, because no one objected, not the court clerks, not the bailiff, not the handful of spectators who had come to watch justice unfold, but had instead witnessed something else entirely. A slow, suffocating realization crept into the air. This wasn't about the law. This was about making a point, and Elijah Brooks understood that better than anyone. He stood there unmoving, as if the weight of that sentence was nothing more than another burden placed on his back, a back that had carried far heavier things. His hands remained at his sides, his posture unwavering, his gaze steady. He did not beg. He did not flinch. He did nothing. And somehow, that nothingness was the most powerful thing in the room. Judge Logan Barrett leaned back slightly in his chair, watching Elijah with the casual detachment of a man who had done this too many times to count. There was no gloating, no satisfaction, just an overwhelming certainty that his word was final. That this was how the system worked. Elijah had seen this before. Different faces, different courtrooms, but always the same script. The judge sitting high above, wielding power like a weapon, the prosecutor delivering charges without emotion, as if reading off a grocery list. The audience, some indifferent, some entertained, but never invested. And the defendant, always the defendant, standing alone, absorbing the weight of a decision that had already been made. He had been here before, he had been sentenced before, and he would be sentenced again. Because for men like him, justice was never blind. It had eyes. It had a voice. It had a gavel that only ever came down in one direction. The silence stretched on, thick and unnatural. Even the bailiff hesitated, glancing at Judge Barrett as if waiting for some unspoken confirmation before stepping forward. Elijah finally exhaled, a slow, measured breath. Not a sigh of defeat, just a breath, a reminder that he was still here, that they had not broken him. Barrett tilted his head slightly, watching him like one might watch a particularly stubborn insect refusing to be crushed. There was something about Elijah's silence that unsettled him. He had expected outrage. He had expected pleading, resistance, anger, but instead he got nothing, and nothing was dangerous, because nothing meant Elijah had expected this. Nothing meant he had already accepted the injustice of it all. And a man who expects injustice does not fear it. The bailiff took another step forward, this time more deliberately. The moment shattered. A few people in the gallery stirred. A chair creaked. The stenographer resumed her furious typing. The courtroom began to move forward as if the last few moments of suffocating stillness had never happened. But Elijah was still standing there, still waiting, and still unbroken. The bailiff stepped forward, reaching for Elijah's arm, but before he could make contact, Elijah spoke. "Before I'm taken," his voice was steady, calm in a way that did not belong in a place like this. "May I make a phone call?" A ripple of surprise passed through the room. It was small, barely perceptible, but it was there. Not in what he had said, but in how he had said it. It was not a request laced with desperation. It was not the voice of a man reaching for a final thread of hope. It was a statement, a formality. Barrett exhaled sharply, shaking his head, then let out a short, mocking chuckle. "A phone call," he repeated, his voice thick with derision. "To who exactly? A lawyer? A friend? Someone who thinks they can change the inevitable?" Elijah did not blink. Barrett smirked, leaning forward slightly. "Or maybe you're hoping someone will pay your bail? Someone out there who still thinks you're worth something?" More scattered chuckles echoed from the gallery, whispers of amusement from those who had already dismissed him. But Elijah, he was unshaken. He simply extended his hand, palm up, a silent request. The bailiff hesitated. There was something unnatural about the moment, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. He had seen men ask for phone calls before, some crying, some angry, some making frantic last attempts to reach a world that had already let them go. But Elijah was not reaching for anything. He was calling something to him. With a sigh, the bailiff pulled a cell phone from his pocket and placed it in Elijah's waiting hand. The metal and glass reflected the dim overhead lighting, but Elijah barely looked at it. He already knew the number. He dialed, one ring, two, a click. And then, in a voice as steady as stone, he spoke 4 words. "It's time. Bring them." Then just as smoothly, he handed the phone back. The room stilled. A few heads turned toward one another in confusion, brows furrowed. Who was them? What was it time for? But Elijah gave no explanation. He simply clasped his hands in front of him, waiting. Judge Barrett's smirk faltered just slightly. He narrowed his eyes, tapping his fingers against the bench. He did not like this. He did not like not knowing. "Elijah," Barrett said slowly, testing the waters, "what exactly do you think that little phone call is going to change?" Elijah did not answer, and somehow that was worse than anything he could have said, because his silence was not submission, it was patience. And patience meant he knew something that Barrett did not. A quiet murmur rippled through the courtroom, barely more than a whisper, but growing, spreading. Even the prosecutor, who had delivered the charges with impersonal detachment, shifted uneasily, because they all felt it now. Something was coming. The bailiff swallowed hard, his grip tightening on Elijah's arm, but he did not pull him away. Not yet, because now they were all waiting, and waiting meant doubt. Barrett's fingers curled against the bench. The gavel was there, inches from his reach, a symbol of control. But for the first time today, it did not feel like he was the one holding power. Not anymore. The courtroom doors burst open, slamming against the walls with a force that sent a shockwave through the room. Heads snapped toward the entrance, eyes widening as heels clicked against the marble floor, crisp and deliberate. She did not pause. She did not ask permission. She walked with purpose, cutting through the heavy air like a blade, her movements controlled, her presence undeniable. The kind of woman who did not knock. She entered. Her black suit was immaculate, tailored to perfection, exuding the kind of power that could not be ignored. A sleek leather briefcase dangled from one hand, a weapon as lethal as any gavel in this courtroom. But it was her eyes, sharp, unwavering, unforgiving, that sent an uncomfortable shift through the gallery. Maya Brooks. Whispers erupted like wildfire. They knew that name, a powerhouse in the legal world, a woman who turned cases into victories, a corporate giant, feared in boardrooms, respected in courtrooms. She was the kind of attorney who did not waste her time on lost causes. So why was she here? The judge's fingers tightened around his gavel. "This is a courtroom, Ms. Brooks," Barrett said, his voice clipped. "You can't just walk in here." She ignored him. Instead, she strode directly to the defense table and stopped. A hush fell over the room as she placed a hand on Elijah Brooks' shoulder. A silent statement. A claim. A warning. Barrett's mouth pressed into a thin line. "I assume you're here for a reason." Maya finally turned to face him. Her expression was unreadable, but her presence filled every inch of the room. "You've made a mistake, Your Honor," she said smoothly, her voice carrying a quiet authority that silenced every whisper. Barrett scoffed, leaning back in his chair. "And you are?" Maya tilted her head slightly as if amused. "Maya Brooks." The name landed like a bomb. Gasps rippled through the gallery. The prosecutor stiffened. The bailiff hesitated, because in that instant, everyone understood. She wasn't just here as a lawyer. She was here as Elijah Brooks's daughter. The heavy courtroom doors hadn't even stopped swinging when three men followed behind Maya Brooks, moving with purpose, precision, and power. They were dressed in dark, impeccably tailored suits, each carrying a sleek leather briefcase embossed with a name that sent an immediate ripple of tension through the room: Warren and Grant, LLP. It was a name that needed no introduction. The most feared law firm in the country. The kind that didn't waste time on petty cases. The kind that didn't walk into courtrooms unless they intended to win. The prosecutor visibly tensed, fingers tightening around her pen. The court stenographer hesitated before resuming her furious typing. Even the bailiff, trained to remain impassive, shifted slightly, his grip tightening on his belt. Judge Logan Barrett's jaw clenched. His fingers drummed once against the bench before stopping abruptly. His posture stiffened, his authority instinctively rising in defense. Maya did not slow. She strode straight to the bench, her heels clicking against the polished floor, not with urgency but with certainty. The three attorneys flanked her, standing like sentinels. She did not ask to speak. She did not acknowledge the gas rippling through the gallery. She simply reached into her bag, pulled out a thick, bound file, and placed it directly in front of Judge Barrett. A single motion, controlled, deliberate, undeniable. For a moment, the room held its breath. Then she spoke. "Before you make another decision, you need to read this." The words landed with a thud heavier than the file itself. Barrett's nostrils flared. He glanced down at the folder but did not reach for it. Instead, his cold blue eyes snapped back up to Maya, his patience razor thin. "You think you can just walk into my courtroom and—" "This isn't your courtroom, Judge." Her voice was calm, but sharp, not raised, not aggressive. But it cut through the air like a blade. The murmurs grew louder now, like distant thunder rolling closer. Barrett's lips pressed into a thin line. "Ms. Brooks," he said slowly, his voice a dangerous edge of controlled irritation. "I don't know what you think you're doing, but this hearing is over. I have already ruled no." It was a single word, but it carried the weight of an avalanche. Barrett's fingers twitched. Maya stepped closer. "I suggest," she said coolly, precisely, "you read that file before you continue embarrassing yourself." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Barrett's face reddened. His authority had never been challenged like this. Not in his own courtroom, not in front of a full audience, not with this level of undeniable force. For a moment, it looked like he might refuse. Then his eyes flickered, just briefly, toward the logo embossed in gold on the folder. Warren and Grant, LLP. His hand tightened into a fist. Judge Logan Barrett's grip tightened on the thick stack of documents, his knuckles whitening as he held them in front of him like a shield. His breathing had slowed, but his heart pounded, a slow, heavy beat against his ribs. His lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line as he forced his eyes back to the first page, needing to see it again, needing to confirm that what he had just read was, in fact, real. But the words hadn't changed. Elijah Brooks. Not a drifter, not some nameless, forgotten old man loitering on private property. A man of brilliance, a man of historical significance, a man whose very name was woven into the foundations of modern aerospace engineering. Judge Barrett's pulse jumped as he turned the page, his hands stiff, methodical, almost robotic in movement. He wasn't in control anymore. His body was just reacting. Another page, another piece of history. Elijah Brooks had been instrumental in designing some of the most advanced guidance systems used by NASA. His patents, not one, not two, but several dozen, had shaped modern spacecraft navigation, propulsion, and aerodynamics. His name had been cited in government research, in military technology, in billion-dollar aerospace contracts. Barrett could feel the pressure building behind his eyes. He had spent his entire career looking down at men like Elijah Brooks, treating them as burdens, as cases to be closed, as nothing more than numbers in a system designed to forget them. But now the man standing before him was not some vagrant clinging to old memories. He was a man who had put astronauts in space. The weight of his own ignorance pressed down on him. The judge flicked his gaze up, just for a second, to see Elijah. The old man hadn't moved. He stood exactly as he had before, calm, steady, patient. He had known. He had known exactly what was coming. The courtroom felt suffocating. Barrett turned another page. This time it was a funding record. His breath caught. Not only was Elijah Brooks a NASA engineer, a patented inventor, a man whose innovations had changed the aerospace industry, he was also a major donor. Not just to scholarships, not just to research institutions, not just to STEM programs across the country, but to the judicial system itself. Judge Barrett's own courthouse had received funding from Elijah Brooks. The walls surrounding him, the very foundation of his own courtroom, had been paid for in part by the same man he had just sentenced without a second thought. The irony was so sharp it almost drew blood. Barrett's jaw tightened painfully. His fingers gripped the file so hard the edges bent. How had he not known? He had ruled over thousands of cases, had seen countless names cross his desk. He had never thought to look deeper, never thought that the man standing before him today could have been anything more than what he assumed. His own arrogance had led him here. He should stop reading. He should slam the file shut, regain control, reassert his authority. But he couldn't. He turned another page, and there it was, the final blow. The property deed, official, legally binding, stamped with the state seal. Elijah Brooks was not a trespasser. He was not some old man illegally wandering into a gated community. He was the rightful owner of the land, the same land he had been arrested for trespassing on. Judge Barrett's blood ran cold. His hands felt clammy, his vision tunneled for a moment. He had accused this man, mocked him, humiliated him, sentenced him to jail, on the assumption that he was nothing. And yet Elijah Brooks was the one who owned the land. Not just a piece of it, all of it. His land, his lake, the same land that the court had declared off limits to him. The silence in the room was unbearable. He could feel dozens of eyes watching him, could sense the unease rolling through the courtroom. Even though no one else could see the documents, they could see what they were doing to him. His control was slipping. Barrett swallowed, trying to gather himself, but it was pointless. He turned back to the deed, the dates, the records, the signatures. They all confirmed the same thing. Elijah Brooks had owned Clearwater Estates long before the people who lived there now. Long before they had built their luxury homes, their private roads, their walls designed to keep men like him out. The very place they had accused him of trespassing on had once belonged to him, and now it still did. Judge Barrett felt something he had never felt before. Not anger, not frustration, something closer to fear. Because this was not just an oversight. This was a mistake so catastrophic it would cost him everything. His hands shook slightly as he flipped back to the first page, scanning over the words again, as if hoping they had changed. They hadn't. Nothing had, except for his entire perception of the man standing before him. For the first time in his entire career, Judge Logan Barrett found himself at a loss. There were no objections to overrule, no loopholes to exploit, no way to undo what had just been revealed. There was only the truth, and the truth had just dismantled him. The courtroom was suffocating in silence. It wasn't the silence of respect or order. It was the kind that settled into the bones, that made the air feel too thick to breathe, that made every second feel like a lifetime. Judge Logan Barrett sat frozen behind the bench, his once commanding presence reduced to something small, something fragile. His grip on the thick stack of documents hadn't loosened. If anything, his fingers had curled tighter around the papers, as if physically holding on to them would keep the truth from slipping through his grasp. But it was too late. The truth had already shattered the courtroom. His breath came in short, uneven bursts, his chest rising and falling in an irregular rhythm as he forced himself to reread the words he had already seen. His mind fought against them, resisted them, rejected them, but the ink on the page did not change. Elijah Brooks was not a trespasser. He was not a drifter, not a squatter, not some forgotten relic of the past. He was a NASA engineer, a visionary, a man whose inventions had changed the world. And worst of all, he was a man who had personally contributed to the very system that had just condemned him. Barrett's pulse pounded in his ears, drowning out every sound but his own ragged breathing. His carefully curated facade, the mask of control he had worn for decades, was slipping with every passing second. He was exposed. He could feel the weight of dozens of eyes fixed on him, watching, waiting, dissecting every twitch of his fingers, every subtle shift in his expression. They had never seen him like this. No one had. The great Judge Logan Barrett, the unshakable force of the Jefferson County Courthouse, was unraveling right before them. His skin had gone ashen, his once flushed cheeks now drained of color. A bead of sweat trickled down the side of his temple, but he did not move to wipe it away. Because he couldn't. He couldn't move. He couldn't speak. He couldn't even breathe properly. The prosecutor, who had spent the entire trial delivering charges against Elijah Brooks with practiced indifference, was now shifting uncomfortably in her seat, her brows knitted in uncertainty. Even the bailiff, a man who had spent years maintaining order in the courtroom, looked hesitant, his posture stiff, his hands hovering near his belt as if expecting something to happen. But nothing did. No one spoke. No one dared to break the silence that had swallowed the room whole. Barrett tried to force his lips to move, tried to summon the commanding tone that had once sent defendants cowering and attorneys scrambling for objections. But when he finally spoke, his voice betrayed him. "This," he started, his throat dry, hoarse, the word barely escaping his lips. "This can't be real. This must be a mistake." But it wasn't. He knew it wasn't. He flipped the pages frantically now, his hands shaking slightly as he scanned the documents again. As if somewhere hidden in these pages, there would be an error, a misprint, something to discredit this entire revelation. But the dates matched, the names matched, the signatures matched. It was all there, all legally documented, all indisputable. His mind flashed back to every cruel word he had spoken to Elijah Brooks just moments ago. "You were caught trespassing. Again." You think nostalgia is ownership. That's not how the world works. The memory of his own sarcastic smirk, his mocking tone, his absolute certainty that Elijah Brooks was just another failure looking for sympathy. It sickened him. Barrett's stomach twisted. His own arrogance had led him here. His own refusal to look beyond his biases had put him in this position, and now there was nowhere to hide. A slight twitch flickered at the corner of his left eye. He clenched his jaw, grinding his teeth so hard his temples ached. This was a nightmare, a waking, inescapable nightmare. He had sentenced a NASA engineer to 30 days in jail for sitting on his own land. The realization slammed into him like a fist to the gut, and he couldn't deny it. The evidence was in his hands. The silence grew heavier. The room felt smaller. The weight of dozens of unblinking eyes pressed against him like a force of gravity he could not escape. A cold sweat ran down his spine. Judge Barrett had spent years commanding respect, controlling the fates of those who stood before him. But today, it was his fate hanging in the balance. His hands, once steady and firm, shook against the polished wood of the bench. He couldn't look up. He couldn't meet the eyes of the man he had just condemned, because he knew. Everyone in this courtroom knew. The great Judge Barrett had made the biggest mistake of his career, and at the center of it all, Elijah Brooks stood, unshaken. His voice, calm, steady, and unwavering, still echoed through the room, lingering in the air like a challenge that could not be dismissed. "Now tell me, Your Honor, do you still think I was trespassing?" It was not a plea. It was not a demand. It was a sentence. Judge Logan Barrett had spent his career passing judgment, rendering decisions that shaped and shattered lives. But now, for the first time in his life, he was the one standing trial, and he knew it. His breath came shallow, unsteady, a sharp contrast to the man standing before him. His hand twitched, his fingers instinctively moving toward his gavel, as if he could regain control with a single strike of wood against wood. But even he knew This was beyond the reach of his authority, because this wasn't just about Elijah Brooks anymore. This was about everything. The courtroom roared to life. Murmurs swelled into full conversations. Reporters scrambled for their phones, their cameras, their laptops. Their fingers flew across keyboards, capturing every second of the moment. Knowing this was history unfolding before them, the headlines were already writing themselves. Disgraced Judge Barrett exposed in racial bias case. NASA engineer sentenced unjustly, legal system in question. Shocking courtroom turn, judge speechless after learning truth. The audience leaned in, whispering, murmuring, gasping, exchanging glances filled with a mixture of awe and disbelief. The energy in the room had changed. No longer a place of quiet, obedient respect for the system, but something far more dangerous. This was resistance. This was the moment the people in the courtroom saw the truth laid bare and refused to look away. The bailiff shifted uneasily, his grip on his belt tightening. He was used to maintaining order, used to enforcing the judge's word without question. But now even he seemed to hesitate, waiting for some kind of command that wasn't coming. Because Judge Barrett was frozen, his mouth opened slightly as if to respond, as if to find some legal justification, some technicality that would make this all go away. But there was nothing, no argument, no defense, no excuse. Because the truth was written in ink, sealed in official records, and now spoken aloud for all to hear. He had sentenced the owner of the land for trespassing on his own property. He had dismissed a NASA engineer as a common vagrant. He had laughed, mocked, and humiliated a man who had built the very systems that sent astronauts beyond the stars. And now everyone knew. His authority, his power, his reputation, his very name was crumbling before his eyes. Elijah Brooks, however, remained as steady as a mountain. He did not gloat. He did not sneer. He simply watched, because he had nothing left to prove. This was the moment that men like Judge Barrett feared most. Not an outburst of rage, not a plea for mercy, but the undeniable truth standing right in front of them. Judge Barrett's hands curled into tight, trembling fists as the noise around him grew louder, unstoppable, undeniable. A rising wave of consequences rushing toward him, and for the first time in his career, he had nowhere to run. The fight for justice is just beginning. More shocking twists are ahead. Don't miss a moment. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to stay with us. Thank you for standing for truth and justice. Where are you watching from? Let us know. The weight of judgment had shifted. For years, Judge Logan Barrett had been the one casting verdicts, delivering sentences, deciding fates with a flick of his wrist and the slam of a gavel. But now, as he sat behind the bench, fingers clenched around the damning documents in front of him, he was the one being judged, and there was no mercy in the eyes that stared back at him. The lawyers in the room, men and women who had once stood before him, who had once argued cases under his unyielding rule, now looked at him with something else entirely: contempt. It was in the way they tilted their heads slightly, their expressions unreadable but their thoughts undeniable. It was in the slight curling of lips, the narrowed eyes, the shared glances between them. Judge Barrett had been untouchable. Not anymore. His authority had been absolute, unquestioned. But now they saw him for what he was, and they were disgusted. A slow shift moved through the room, a silent reckoning as attorneys, prosecutors, and legal professionals watched a man who had once ruled over them crumble under the very system he had so mercilessly upheld. They had no sympathy for him. He hadn't had any for them. Barrett swallowed, his throat dry. He could feel it happening. The quiet exodus, the subtle, deliberate retreat. The judges who had been seated in the back, the ones who had watched the events unfold with growing unease, were leaving. Not all at once, not in a rush. That would draw too much attention. But one by one, they gathered their things, adjusted their robes, and slipped out through the side doors. A silent message. This was a disaster, a scandal, and they wanted no part of it. Barrett's fingers curled into a fist. His skin was clammy, his once steady breathing now shallow. He had never been ignored like this before. He had never been left behind. But now even the people who had once stood beside him were walking away, because his name was already burning. and no one wanted to be caught in the fire. And in that moment, as the weight of his own arrogance crushed him, Judge Logan Barrett realized this was not a trial about Elijah Brooks. It was a trial about himself, and Maya Brooks knew it. She stood before him, her presence commanding, immovable, her eyes locked onto his with an intensity that burned. Then, with deadly precision, she spoke. "We will not sue to tarnish the reputation of a judge." A single beat of silence. Then, the strike. "Because that would require you to have had one in the first place." The words cut through the courtroom like a blade. A gasp rippled through the audience. Sharp, involuntary, stunned. Barrett flinched, not visibly, not dramatically, but Maya saw it. She saw the way his jaw clenched, the way his fingers tightened slightly against the desk, as if grasping for control that had long since slipped away. For the first time in his career, he had no response. Nothing to counter with, nothing to argue. Because the worst part of it all, the most unbearable part, was that she was right. This was not a courtroom debate. This was not about evidence or legal technicalities. This was a verdict, and he had sentenced himself. The arrogance that had once made him untouchable had now left him exposed. The certainty with which he had ruled over others had turned against him, leaving him stripped, hollow. The courtroom felt like it was closing in on him. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the room bearing down on him. The reporters, their fingers moving rapidly, capturing every second of his humiliation. The attorneys, their gazes filled with nothing but disdain. The other judges, the ones who had already slipped away, abandoning him. And then there was Elijah Brooks, still standing, still watching, and worst of all, still waiting. Because Elijah had never needed to raise his voice, never needed to demand justice. He had simply stood there and let the truth do its work. And now Barrett had to live with it. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. Media attention exploded the moment the courtroom incident spilled into the public sphere, transforming what had once been a hushed legal proceeding into a full-scale national scandal. In newspapers, on television, and across social media, headlines screamed in unison: "Racist judge exposed in explosive scandal," and "NASA engineer jailed for sitting by his own lake, the injustice of the century." Every outlet, from venerable broadsheets to online news aggregators, seized upon the story, each headline more incendiary than the last. These sensational declarations did more than report the facts. They ignited outrage and stoked the flames of a public already weary of a system marred by prejudice and impunity. It wasn't long before live broadcasts showed images of Judge Logan Barrett, his once imperious face now ashen, his hands trembling as he clutched the documents that had so irrevocably unmasked his bias. The camera zoomed in on his pallid expression, capturing every moment of his humiliation as he sat, isolated on his bench, his authority in tatters. Reporters crowded the courthouse steps, their microphones thrust forward and their voices overlapping in a cacophony of urgent questions. "How could a judge with such a pristine record fall so low?" one anchor demanded. "Is our legal system so deeply entrenched in discrimination that even the highest court is not immune?" Another correspondent, speaking directly to the camera, declared, "The evidence is undeniable. A NASA engineer, a man whose innovations once propelled our nation into space, has been wrongfully condemned, while this judge, whose rulings have long been steeped in bias, now faces the full force of public scrutiny." The rapid spread of these reports ensured that within hours, every major news network was devoting primetime segments to the scandal. Editorials and opinion pieces blasted the legal establishment, questioning not only Barrett's personal integrity, but the broader system that allowed his unchecked arrogance to thrive. Within the corridors of power, a palpable shift occurred. The legal establishment, once unwavering in its deference to Barrett's authority, now found itself forced into damage control. Colleagues who had once lauded his decisive rulings began distancing themselves from him. In whispered conversations in the hushed hallways of the courthouse, Senior lawyers exchanged knowing glances, their eyes betraying a mix of shock and disdain. "How could we have let this happen?" one remarked quietly to another, his voice laden with regret and disbelief. The very institutions that had once protected Barrett's unchecked power now turned their backs on him, fearful that his disgrace might taint their own reputations. Judges who had sat alongside him during countless proceedings were seen gathering their belongings and slipping quietly out of the courtroom. Their departures a silent admission that association with him was now a liability too great to bear. As the storm of public outrage intensified, government officials and legal watchdogs were forced to take action. The Judicial Conduct Review Board, under immense pressure from both lawmakers and a vociferous public, announced an immediate investigation into Barrett's conduct. Rumors swirled that the inquiry would extend beyond this single case, reaching back into years of his controversial rulings. Lawmakers, emboldened by the fervor of a public demanding accountability, called for swift reforms aimed at dismantling the systemic biases that had allowed such abuses of power to fester unchecked. In legislative halls, fiery debates ensued as politicians, representing a broad spectrum of opinions, argued the merits of overhauling the entire judicial oversight process. Proposals ranged from the establishment of independent ethics panels to more radical measures designed to strip judges of any semblance of immunity from public accountability. In every corner of the country, citizens, empowered by the immediacy of the scandal, demanded change, their voices merging into a chorus of protest that could not be ignored. Amid this maelstrom of accusations, investigations, and public indignation, one figure's exit from the courtroom resonated with a quiet, unassailable dignity. Elijah Brooks, the man at the heart of the scandal, did not leave amid a clamor of despair or a crescendo of anger. Instead, he rose from his seat with a serene determination that spoke volumes without a single raised voice or tearful plea. There was no fanfare, no triumphant shout proclaiming his innocence. His departure was marked only by the quiet, measured steps of a man who had long internalized the injustice thrust upon him and had, in his own unspoken way, achieved a victory over a corrupt system. As he walked out of the courtroom, his back straight and his gaze unwavering, the cameras captured an image that would soon become emblematic of the entire debacle. A silent figure of quiet strength and unyielding truth, his every step resonating as a powerful repudiation of the injustice he had endured. In stark contrast to the chaotic fervor directed at Judge Barrett, Elijah Brooks's exit was a study in stoic grace. His demeanor was not one of a defeated man resigned to a fate of subjugation. Rather, it was that of a man who had faced down the worst that the legal system could inflict and emerge, if not unscathed, then certainly unbowed. As he stepped into the light of a now uncertain future, his measured stride and calm composure served as a tacit challenge to those who had wielded their power without accountability. His silence spoke louder than any protest, his dignity more potent than any outcry. In that moment, Elijah transformed from a mere defendant into a symbol, a living testament to the resilience of truth in the face of overwhelming prejudice and corruption. The impact of the scandal rippled far beyond the courthouse walls. Within hours, social media platforms exploded with hashtags and trending topics that captured the essence of the debacle. Hashtags such as Barrett Exposed, Justice for Elijah, and Injustice of the Century trended worldwide, galvanizing a movement of activists, legal reformers, and ordinary citizens who demanded not only justice for Elijah Brooks, but sweeping changes to an entire system that had long tolerated discrimination and elitism. Viral videos, shared by millions, showed snippets of the courtroom's most damning moments. Barrett's face as it turned ashen, the silent, resolute gaze of Elijah, and the palpable tension that had electrified every inch of that chamber. News anchors and pundits debated furiously on primetime shows, their analyses dissecting every aspect of the case, from Barrett's seemingly casual disregard for due process to the systemic failures that had allowed such a miscarriage of justice to occur. Editorial pages, once filled with routine commentary on legal matters, were now dominated by impassioned calls for accountability and reform. Columnists argued that Barrett's downfall was not merely the consequence of one man's hubris, but a symptom of a deeper, more pervasive rot within the judicial system, a system that had, for far too long, permitted the powerful to trample the rights of the vulnerable with impunity. Even as the media's relentless assault continued unabated, the corridors of power within the legal community underwent a profound transformation. Judges who had once been Barrett's staunch allies began to speak out, their voices emerging from the shadows to denounce the prejudices and unchecked authority that had defined his tenure. Law firms, some of which had long benefited from the opaque networks of influence that Barrett represented, now found themselves under intense scrutiny. Senior partners issued statements expressing regret over their past associations and pledging support for a comprehensive review of judicial practices. Legal scholars, too, weighed in on the crisis, citing Barrett's case as a stark example of how personal bias could corrupt the very foundations of justice. A reminder that no individual, regardless of his position, was beyond reproach. At the heart of this upheaval was a profound reckoning with the values that the legal system claimed to uphold. The nation, having long been divided over issues of race, power, and equality, now witnessed a tangible moment of accountability, a moment when the truth, no matter how inconvenient or uncomfortable, could no longer be suppressed by the trappings of authority. The widespread public outcry and the swift response of the investigative bodies signaled a new era, one in which the mechanisms of justice would be held to a higher standard, and those who abused their power would face consequences that were both swift and severe. Throughout the entire maelstrom of controversy, one image remained seared into the collective consciousness: a silent, resolute figure walking away from the ruins of a corrupt system. Elijah Brooks, in his quiet triumph, had become more than just a defendant. He had become a beacon of hope for all those who had ever been wronged by a system that was supposed to protect them. His dignified exit, captured by countless cameras and immortalized in headlines and social media posts, spoke of a truth that could never be denied: that in the struggle against injustice, even the most powerful can fall, and that the spirit of a man who refuses to be broken can illuminate the darkest corners of oppression. As the days passed, the full ramifications of the scandal began to unfold. Investigations into Judge Barrett's rulings expanded rapidly, uncovering patterns of discrimination that shocked even the most jaded legal observers. Legislative hearings were convened, bringing together lawmakers, legal experts, and civil rights advocates to chart a course for reform. Public opinion, once indifferent to the slow grind of bureaucratic injustice, had now been ignited into a fervor that demanded radical change. Communities across the country organized rallies and town hall meetings, their chants echoing with the refrain that justice must be equal, that the scales of law must be balanced, and that no one, no matter how high their station, should be allowed to trample the rights of the many in favor of the privileges of the few. In the midst of this upheaval, Judge Barrett found himself increasingly isolated. His once mighty persona, built on years of unchallenged power, had been eroded by the relentless tide of evidence and public indignation. Colleagues formerly silent in his presence now turned away. Friends who once offered quiet assurances no longer dared to meet his gaze. The legal community, now ablaze with calls for accountability, had little patience left for a man whose downfall was as spectacular as it was inevitable. His future on the bench, once assured by decades of service and the deference of those who followed him, now hung by a thread that was being pulled tighter by the unyielding forces of justice and reform. In contrast, as the media's relentless barrage continued to intensify, Elijah Brooks' quiet departure from the courtroom resonated as an enduring symbol of victory. Without a word, without a gesture of triumph, he had left the scene of his own injustice with a calm that defied the storm raging behind him. His exit was not an act of surrender, but a silent, powerful statement that truth and dignity could not be vanquished by corruption and bias. With each step he took away from that chamber, he carried with him not only the burden of his own past sufferings, but also the hope of a future where justice was not a commodity to be manipulated by the powerful. His resolute silence, immortalized in the flashing images on television screens and the viral posts on social media, sent a message that echoed far beyond the confines of that courtroom. That even in a system marred by injustice, The spirit of an individual can rise above the forces that seek to crush it. Thus, as the relentless tide of media coverage, public outcry, and institutional reform swirled around Judge Barrett, his once unassailable authority crumbled like a house of cards in a storm. The scandal that had erupted was not merely a momentary lapse in judicial conduct. It was a transformative event that exposed the deep-seated inequities of a system long dominated by unchecked power and prejudice. In that tumultuous aftermath, while the legal establishment scrambled to restore its credibility and reassert its authority, Elijah Brooks's quiet, dignified walk away from the courtroom became a rallying cry for justice, a symbol of the triumph of truth over tyranny, and a reminder that no one, not even a judge steeped in authority, is immune from the consequences of their actions. The gavel fell with a resounding finality that echoed through the now silent courtroom. Yet it was not the sound of justice being served. It was the sound of a system collapsing under the weight of its own corruption. In that moment, as the dust of scandal settled and the faces of those present betrayed a mix of disbelief and resolve, one message rang out louder than any verdict. Justice is not always on the side of the powerful, but the truth always wins. This was not an abstract concept debated in legal treatises or lofty speeches. It was a lived reality, as tangible and brutal as the cold steel of a prison cell, and as undeniable as the evidence that had just shattered decades of entrenched prejudice. In the days that followed, the fallout from the courtroom debacle rippled across the nation. News outlets, both traditional and digital, splashed sensational headlines across their front pages and scrolling tickers. "Racist judge exposed. The fall of a tyrant," screamed one headline, while another boldly declared, "NASA engineers' truth triumphs over injustice." Every channel, from national broadcasts to local radio stations, was abuzz with discussions about how a judge, once considered untouchable by virtue of his position and power, had been unmasked as nothing more than a relic of a bygone era of bias. In every report, pundits, legal experts, and everyday citizens converged on the same conclusion. The scales of justice, though long tilted in favor of the powerful, had been rebalanced by the unstoppable force of truth. Throughout the media frenzy, countless articles recounted the harrowing details of that fateful day, the shattering silence in the courtroom, the damning documents that exposed years of prejudice, and the moment when Elijah Brooks, the wronged NASA engineer, whose innovations had once propelled humanity to the stars, had risen with quiet dignity to challenge the oppressive authority of Judge Barrett. Reporters recounted how, as the damning evidence unfolded before a stunned audience, Barrett's own arrogance turned against him. His trembling hands and ashen face were captured by cameras and broadcast live, a testament to the moment when his carefully constructed facade crumbled in the face of irrefutable truth. The narrative was clear. A man who had long wielded his power to crush those he deemed inferior was now being held accountable, and his downfall was a victory for every individual who had ever been marginalized by an unjust system. Within the hallowed halls of the judiciary, the shock was equally palpable. Colleagues and peers, once deferential to Barrett's unyielding authority, now looked upon him with open disdain. Meetings that were once marked by hushed respect turned into quiet murmurs of disapproval as legal luminaries and reform advocates debated the implications of his disgrace. Some judges, fearing that their own reputations might become tainted by association, began to distance themselves from the scandal. They left courtrooms quietly, slipping away from the corridors of power as if the mere presence of Barrett's shadow could undermine their own hard-won credibility. In a system that had long been insulated from accountability, this retreat was nothing short of seismic, a clear indication that the old order was crumbling, unable to withstand the relentless surge of public demand for reform and transparency. As the legal establishment reeled, lawmakers seized upon the moment to call for sweeping changes. Parliamentary committees convened emergency sessions to address systemic biases, and proposals for new oversight measures were introduced with fervor. Bills aimed at enhancing judicial accountability, ensuring greater transparency in court proceedings, and protecting the rights of the marginalized were fast-tracked. In heated debates across legislative chambers, advocates argued passionately that the truth, however inconvenient, must prevail over the entrenched power structures that had long manipulated the scales of justice. This is not merely an isolated incident, declared one influential senator during a televised hearing. It is the culmination of years of injustice, a damning indictment of a system that has consistently sided with the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. The call for change reverberated not only through the corridors of government, but also across communities and online platforms, where citizens demanded that those who held power be held to account. Amid this maelstrom of reform and public scrutiny, Elijah Brooks emerged as an emblem of hope and resilience. Unlike many who had been swept away by the tempest of injustice, Elijah's quiet dignity had never wavered. He did not march out of the courthouse with triumphant shouts or tearful protests. Instead, he left with a calm, measured stride that spoke volumes of a man who had weathered the storm of injustice and emerged unbroken. His silence in the face of overwhelming adversity was not an admission of defeat, but a profound statement of strength. In his eyes, there was no room for anger or bitterness, only the serene certainty of truth that in the end always prevails. His departure from the courtroom was captured by journalists and quickly turned into a symbol of righteous defiance, a living reminder that, while those in power might manipulate the law to serve their interests, the immutable nature of truth would eventually cast its light on the darkest corners of injustice. The media's relentless assault on Judge Barrett, however, did not stop with sensational headlines and scathing editorials. It ushered in a period of intense introspection and debate among legal scholars, civil rights activists, and the general public. Editorial pages in major newspapers became battlegrounds for arguments over the integrity of the judicial system. Some argued that Barrett's downfall was a rare moment of long overdue accountability, a beacon of hope that would usher in an era of reform and fairness. Others, though fewer in number, decried the turn of events as an anomaly, a momentary lapse in an otherwise respectable institution. Yet as the investigation unfolded and more damning evidence came to light, even the most skeptical voices were forced to acknowledge that Barrett's case was symptomatic of a broader, systemic failure. The once opaque corridors of judicial power were now under the unforgiving glare of public scrutiny, and nothing could hide from the all-seeing eyes of a society determined to see justice done. In every televised debate, in every social media post, and in every fervent discussion at dinner tables across the country, one truth became inescapably clear. While the law might often bend to the will of the powerful, the truth was a force that could not be contained or corrupted. It was a constant, unyielding beacon that illuminated the dark recesses of prejudice and dishonesty. The scandal that had erupted in that courtroom was not just about the wrongful conviction of a brilliant engineer. It was a damning indictment of a system that had, for far too long, allowed personal biases and unchecked authority to dictate the fates of ordinary people. The narrative was simple yet profound. No matter how entrenched the power structures might be, or how meticulously they shielded themselves with layers of bureaucratic obfuscation, the truth always finds a way to rise above the mire. It is the one currency that never devalues, the one standard by which all others are measured, and in the end, it is the only force capable of delivering genuine justice. The events that transpired in that courtroom and the subsequent media frenzy served as a powerful catalyst for change. Across the nation, legal institutions were forced to confront uncomfortable truths about their own operations. Training programs on implicit bias were overhauled, ethical standards were re-examined, and new protocols were introduced to ensure that judges and other officials could no longer hide behind the facade of unassailable authority. Public pressure, amplified by the unrelenting power of modern communication, had initiated a profound shift in the very foundation of justice. The reverberations of this transformation were felt not only in the halls of government, but also in communities that had long suffered under the weight of injustice. For many, the scandal was a turning point, a moment when the collective voice of the people broke through the silence and forced a reckoning with a system that had allowed the powerful to dominate without accountability. As the investigation into Judge Barrett's conduct progressed and the calls for reform grew louder, the legacy of that day began to crystallize into something far greater than a mere scandal. It became a symbol of hope for all those who had ever been marginalized by a system that was supposed to protect them, a testament to the enduring power of truth and the resilience of the human spirit in the face of overwhelming adversity. The message was clear and unequivocal. Justice is not always on the side of the powerful, but the truth always wins. This message, etched into the collective memory of a nation, served as a rallying cry for reform, an inspiration for activists and citizens alike, and a reminder that even in the darkest moments of injustice, there exists a light that no amount of power or corruption can ever extinguish. In the end, as the tumult of scandal receded and the wounds of injustice began to heal, the final message emerged not as the triumph of any one individual, but as the undeniable victory of truth over tyranny. It was a message that resonated deeply within the hearts of all who had witnessed the fall of an unjust system and the quiet, unyielding rise of a man who had stood tall in the face of overwhelming prejudice. It was a testament to the enduring belief that while the scales of justice may be manipulated by those in power, the truth remains an immutable force that, no matter how long it is suppressed, will eventually break free and restore balance. And so, as the sun rose on a new day marked by hope and transformation, the legacy of that courtroom battle stood as a powerful reminder. In the eternal struggle between power and truth, it is truth alone that holds the ultimate victory. What do you think? Is justice truly blind, or does it simply choose who to see? Elijah Brooks never raised his voice. He never begged, never pleaded. He didn't need to, because the truth spoke for itself. This case was never about one man. It was about a system that failed him, a system that was designed to serve justice, but, too often, serves power instead. And today that system was exposed for what it truly is. But how many others have suffered in silence? How many stories have gone unheard? How many verdicts have been passed in courtrooms just like this one, where the weight of prejudice outweighs the evidence? This isn't just one case. This is a reckoning. If you believe this story needs to be heard, if you believe in exposing injustice, in demanding accountability, in making sure this never happens again, then make your voice count. Like, share, follow. Let the world see. Let them know. Because justice isn't real until it belongs to everyone.